Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om, Om, Om. Welcome everybody back to this class series that we're having on the topic of cooperative communities. And of course, it originates from Swami Kriyananda's original book many years ago, Cooperative Communities, How to Start Them and Why, which later was Intentional Communities, How to Start Them and Why. And today is the fourth class in this series, and it very well may be the last class, but not really the last class, because we're going to have next week, assuming I finish up our topic this week, next week we're going to dedicate it to question and answers. And some of you have sent questions in, and I'm not going to answer those questions this week. I'm saving all of the questions for next week, and I encourage you, if you have any interest in this topic, to what questions might you have that might be universal, either specific to you or perhaps general. Send those questions in. Put them in the chat box, or you can email me, jaya@anandaindia.org, and I'll try to address them next week. Now, this week, I want to begin. I titled this week's class Advice for Success, but I want to start by kind of outlining what my goals have been for this class series and why I'm interested in doing this and have been interested in doing this. And you could say they're specific and they're also in general. And generally, I wanted to share the message of Paramhansa Yogananda about communities. He said that in the future, this will be a social model for the future. And it'll be a solution also, perhaps, if difficult times come. But that's, you might say, a practical reason. But for me personally, I've found that the benefit is spiritual more than, practicality. I feel I could probably survive one place or another, but spiritually I found it really, really helpful. And I think since my interest is on that side, I wanted to share that to the benefits that come, not just practical benefits, but spiritual benefits for that. So I wanted to get this message out, share it, which Swami Kriyananda dedicated much of it, was one of the core missions of his life, was to share this message. And in that tradition also, to share this with people, because it has meaning for the future. And I think by sharing it and by being a part of it, we put ourselves in tune spiritually with my guru's message, Paramhansa Yogananda. So I do think that's one, you might say, a general goal. Specifically, I think, or generally also, I think perhaps we can plant seeds now, and the need, as I explained in the earlier classes, for experimentation. We have to realize, forming communities as a social model is not something that's you could call common. It's totally uncommon, but it's not a popular thing in general society. But that's to be expected in this day and age. I think one of my hopes is that people will be encouraged by, and with this thought, that awareness generally in the world, in our generation, generations to come, perhaps centuries, millennia to come, is expanding. There's greater awareness. And you could say there's a general upward trend in consciousness toward greater expanded awareness. That's encouraging. And hold that, this is what the great ones have said, and hold that thought, because yes, society goes through the ups and downs, and you look around and you think, negativity is on the rise. Well, these are temporary things. In the longer rhythm, positivity or greater awareness, higher consciousness is on the rise in the long stretch of things. And that is something we should share. We should work in that spirit and keeping that in mind. So that's one of my goals, is to share that message. And in the midst of that, I want to encourage groups of all sorts to take up this idea of community. Right now, you could say it's focused. My focus has been on Ananda Sangha, Ananda's community, but this is something meant for larger, and not just Ananda groups, and not just religious groups. And I think I've made the point that it's historically, religious groups have been the most long-lasting and tend to be most successful for a lot of reasons. The shared ideals, you might say, shared goals being one of them, and a willingness to sacrifice for those goals is one of the reasons. But ideally, there could be other reasons. And whatever that reasons is, secular reasons, non-religious reasons to come together. And so getting these seeds out there, I think, is important as well. So you could say just generally, that's what I'd like to encourage. We need models of all sorts, but you could say I do have also specific goals in all this. And one is I want to share this message of cooperative communities, intentional communities, specifically with disciples of Paramhansa Yogananda, of which I consider myself one, and Ananda Sangha is based upon that. And so specifically, Ananda has taken up this message to share the idea of intentional communities, and not just to talk about it, to put them into practice. And Ananda Sangha has created communities, Ananda Village being the first one. But since that time, we've expanded in other ways in cities and in different forms. And there's, in Italy and India, these sorts of things are coming up. And so obviously I have the goal, I'd like to see this message taken up by people who are disciples. And many of you, I think, who are watching, not all, but many, are disciples of this path. And I want to, you might say, aiming at you to realize the spiritual benefit of your own spiritual life, to take this up, to take this banner up and try to do what you can. Not everybody can, circumstances being what they are, but some of you could. And so that's, you could say, a specific one of my goals is to motivate you. Now, my history, of course, has been in America and in India. And so those are the two countries or the two regions I've been most interested in. And America does have something, but it needs more. We haven't created nearly fulfilled what Kriyananda's and Yogananda's hopes were. Much more work needs to be done here, and we have to find ways to do that, whether it's within the Ananda organization or perhaps some people affiliated with other disciples, but under the banner of Paramhansa Yogananda's message. And of course, in India, we very much need that. We need that. We haven't been able to get off the ground with that idea. We have centers, but we don't have this expression as a community. And I do think that this is in the works, and I'm planting that seed for those of you who are living in India, or perhaps even some foreigners who like to go to India, and to be able, we can do this together there. But also, I don't want to limit it to those two regions. It could happen South America, Asia, other places as well. Why not? Europe, obviously, would be a good place to plant these seeds and get something started. So that's, you could say, that's my more specific idea. And it doesn't, and people come, we invite people to come to Ananda Village, to the Ananda communities in America, and they see that, and sometimes there can be inspiration that comes from that, but sometimes it can be a little bit daunting. Oh my God, how can you possibly do something like this? And they just say, oh, I can't do that. But yes, we can. Why can't people, let's say in India, why can't people get together and buy an apartment or flat, a building, and share, go in, create it in the city where it's going to work? People could come together and find other models. You see, it's good to have a nice example as an Ananda Village, what can happen, but we also have to realize that there are other models as well. And so you could say, this is my, you might say, my motivation of what I'm trying to do with these series of classes. And in this last fourth class, I'd like to give a little more general advice. One, that there are many models, and it's the principles here that we're speaking about, and by trying to find ways to put the principles that underlie a community, teamwork, cooperation, working together, harmony. It's these principles that you might say are the important element. A community in and of itself that doesn't have those things probably is not going to survive, but it's the expression of those. So if you have these ideals, it's so much better if we can find ways to practically put ideals into practice. And I think this was when Yogananda came to the America, he planted seeds of in every avenue he could think of, in education, in business, in family life, and how to put the teachings of self-realization into practical practice. He actually even said that in the future, self-realization will be the religion of the future. Now, he didn't mean self-realization in terms of an organization or even his organization or his teachings, the larger principle that we can find divinity. We must define that divinity. God is within the inner kingdom within each one of us. And that is, you could say, the religion of the future. But we can't leave it as a philosophy. We have to put it into practical applications. So in whatever way we can do that and we can express it, and if we can express these principles of community, which were so very important to Yogananda and especially to Swami Kriyananda, how much better that would be. And remember, it's just like, even in the Gita, it says, even a little practice of this Dharma, even a little practice of this inward religion will free one from dire fears and colossal sufferings. And we use that when we do our Kriya initiations and spread that teaching, but it applies in everything we do. Even a little practice in the direction that we are wanting to go will free one from dire fears and colossal sufferings. And that applies to all the spiritual teachings. Now, I read a statistic not too long ago, just coming back to that thought about, getting together in the urban settings. Ananda started in the countryside, in Ananda village, out in the country, but as I mentioned in previous class, difficulty in jobs, not everybody can live in the country. It's hard to, find avenues to support oneself. And all of these reasons, schools, so on, led us to also starting branch communities, which are now independent communities of their own within the cities. And the statistic I read was that a couple hundred years ago, let's say 19th century, 150 years ago, 80% of the world's population lived in farms, self-sufficient. Much of them were self-sufficient farming. And now, 150 years later, 80% now live in urban environments. And so consequently, now some idealists think, we're going to return to nature. And I don't really, maybe in a long time, maybe in Satya Yuga, I don't think that's going to happen in this yuga, this thousands of years to come. I think this densification, I don't know if it's going to be thousands of years, but certainly in the centuries that are coming, I don't think densification will stop. Now, perhaps it won't be in big cities, but small towns are growing right now, very popular, to go into those medium-sized places. Certainly not self-sufficient agriculture out in the countryside. And so I think it's a nice ideal. And when people think about starting communities, say, let's go and be self-sufficient on the country, I think it's practical to grow your own vegetables to much as degree, but really that's not going to be the model for most people. So why not get together in the city? Now, what Ananda communities have done in America, the urban communities, which are most of our communities, they have an urban community where people can live together, worship together, have community life in an urban setting. They've densified, having buildings or property that is at apartment complexes. But then they bought property out in the country. So people can gather together. And then you can buy 5-10 acres out in the country where you can grow food, where you can have retreats, where there can be recreation. People could go there to get away and perhaps enjoy both and rather than either or. And so I throw that out there as something to think about. Get together in the city and then maybe get something out in the country where people can go on the weekends to have programs there. And this is a I think, very practical form. What we need, though, is experiments, models, and of all sorts, and even not just Ananda, that ideally there be other groups as well. But I do come back that I think in this day and age, most of the ones that are going to be coherently successful over time will have some spiritual basis to it, religious base. Now, there's a danger of that, and why some people don't like that idea, because historically, religion tends to build walls and be inward looking, us and not you. And religion must be, and I don't think this is the future, religion, when we realize it's Master's message that God is within, we begin then to see that these outer forms are not the essence. So we are trying to, in Ananda, our ideal here, is to be embracive. Yes, we have our core beliefs, but we embrace others as well. And this is the spirit that must be in the community, especially if we're going to be a religious-based community. You have to be open. I know in the early days of Ananda's existence, there was a very high communitarian ideal in America in the latter half of the 20th century. And there would be conferences, community conferences of people who were trying to start conferences. And Ananda wasn't very often invited to those even. People just sort of dismissed Ananda because we were religiously based, you see. And so, but the fact was, and as time went on, people began to see we actually were successful. We were practical. And that religious has its place, but spirituality has its place in a community. But I do agree that yes, it'd be nice to find other models if they're there. The important point is, going back to what Swamiji said, is what works. And I think this is, we were to share advice, one of the principles that I would say that Swami Kriyananda said, and I'm just echoing here, he says, one should not start communities and whatever you can do, but don't expect miracles. It's directional. Even a little practice of this in religion, even a little practice of these principles, bringing them into whatever we're doing. It's enough, you could say, as Swamiji said, it's enough if a new way of life is better than the old one. And so consequently, we're moving in that be practical about it. I know one objection that others who were trying to start communities in the 1970s, 1980s, had about Ananda, who says, well, you're too normal. Our model was not, you might say, we didn't have a revolutionary system in place in terms of a revolutionary economic system, a revolutionary distribution of resources systems, these types of things. Because Swami Kriyananda he wanted to be practical. He says don't ask people to adopt a way of life that is too far removed from what they're used to. Now, is that compromising one's higher ideal? Well, no, because the higher ideal is not based upon a system. The higher ideal is based upon values, based upon consciousness, based upon inner values. And if you have the right attitudes, like I've mentioned, these cooperation, harmony, teamwork, working together, if you have those in place, the system is going to take care of itself. And you find, then again, we came back in Ananda to what works. And so consequently, people would come and we had started business and we'd pay salaries like that. And we would charge people for the use of this, fees for this, that, and everything, as opposed to trying to communize or total communitarianism, which is a nice model in many ways. But it was very difficult for people to adopt that. And it took a lot of, you might say, overhead in terms of time and energy, and it was beyond people's ability. So I think whatever you do, now I'm not speaking against those forms, Haribol if they can happen, but don't set your goals beyond the ability of the people who are members of your community can actually embrace and do. Go with what works, and then focus on the right attitudes, focus on the right, expressions of spiritual attitudes at least. And so again, I'll come back. I think it's very, very helpful. You have to clarify your core beliefs. Policies, and systems have a little bit of their place. You have to have something, but they have to be in expressions from inside out rather than system and then trying to change people inside. So at Ananda, we had certain policies, certain things that we had expectations. And so what I'm suggesting here is any group that wants to start does have to be clear of what their expectations are. It can't be amorphous because it doesn't gain, coherence, and you need that coherence to have magnetism. And of course, things can change, of course, as time goes by, but to just be totally amorphous is not going to be helpful. And so we had decided early in our evolution that Ananda would be a spiritual community based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. Now that could be, based on the teachings of like Oroville or Aurobindo, or it could be based on the teachings like Yogaville in the East Coast of the United States of Satchidananda, or it could be based even on the teachings of Jesus Christ. And it could be, they could be some religious domination. It could be whatever, but you have to have some basic understanding of what it's based on. Now, I've mentioned spiritual basis. Could be others if you can make it work. It could be others that there's, and I think it's possible, and but it'd be for you to find out, see if that works. I think the second point at Ananda, our experience was membership would be for those, not just that Paramhansa Yogananda would be our ideals, but membership would be for those who considered themselves disciples of Yogananda. Now, we found for us this works, but again, I don't want to feel that this has to be the case. You need to find something that works for you. And there would be, we asked that there be people came into the community. We didn't accept somebody says, oh, I'm a disciple, I want to do this. We set up a trial period. And I think this is something, as once you are established, you need to have, you can't just, you have to, is it really true? Are people coming in to accept new members? Now, before you have new members, you actually have to have something. And I think that depends upon commitment. And I think the individual people who are going to start, I think I would recommend, from what I've observed, that you gather together those people who have demonstrated some sort of commitment, rather than just philosophical attunement to it. And that commitment can take different forms. It could be commitment of a certain amount of energy. It could be commitment of resources, financial commitment. Certainly, I've mentioned the spiritual commitment of discipleship. That's another type of commitment. But if people make a commitment, they're invested in the project. And investment can be expressed in a number of different ways. And so if there's no investment, then what you find is it's just philosophy. And as I mentioned in the early days when I met Swami Kriyananda and he was promoting this idea, he would have meetings of those who were interested at his flat in San Francisco, and 20, 30 people would come and they'd debate all sorts of things. And I think of those 20, 30 people that I met there, maybe two or three at most actually ended up out developing the commitment. So what did their opinions matter at first? I mean, it was good to get the discussion going, but it's really those people who make the commitment are the ones that you listen to. And that goes to a principle that has been very important in Ananda over the years in terms of operation and guidance and decision-making. Those we have given authority to those people, authority to make decisions, to set the course, you might say, to those people who have taken and have been willing and demonstrate responsibility. In other words, somebody comes in the door and says, oh, you should do it this way, you should do it that way, but they're not invested in the situation and they haven't assumed any responsibility. So obviously you just don't go because they said so, but those people who have invested their time and energy over a period of time, they get to be the ones, who make the decision. And with this, to the large degree, this is how we've tried to do it. And we've tried to distribute decision-making broadly, and in terms of practical decision-making broadly within members who show initiative. And they take it, and they says, okay, you do this enough. Well, you could, you become the manager of that, this or that. And that usually works best. Now, sometimes you just have to ask somebody to take that responsibility, and that's because the need is there. But nevertheless, if they take responsibility, then they should be the one to make the decision, whether to buy this or buy that. And because if it fails, well, whose fault is that? It was that person's fault. Now, so this is just a basic principle. Same time, it's this not having too many rules. Again, working by spirit rather than rules. Obviously, you need to have some protocols, rules of that sort. And Ananda's had a few. No drugs, no alcohol, those things that we've adopted. Obviously, you can't be abusive to one another. You got to, sometimes we have had people that, they're devotees and everything, but they cannot get along with anybody, if that's okay too. But to the degree if the person interacting in an abusive way with other people, maybe they ought to be, kind of a supporter living elsewhere on their own property rather than part of the community itself. So there has to be some sort of protocols, and this is, of course, for each group to make that on their own. What works for them to go forward? I've raised this other point, just touched on it a little bit, but within any community of people, there are certain people that are going to have more energy, more creativity, more skills. Now, are those in attunement? Are they in the right spirit? And if they embrace the right spiritual attitudes and spirit, these people naturally rise to the top. And I think this is just how it is. Beings are not all the same. Some are going to have higher qualities than others. And it's these people that are you could say they're natural leaders of a community, if their disposition is one to take an active role in leadership. And every community to some degree, needs leadership. Now that leadership, in starting a community such as Ananda, that fell upon Swami Kriyananda. Without his leadership, to set the tone, to set the guidance, it wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened at all. So I think most communities takes somebody, an individual, to get the ball rolling, to take responsibility, to push it forward. It does not have to be one person. It often is, because somebody's idea takes fruit or bears fruit in somebody's consciousness. But the principle of leadership is important. And I think this is something Swami Kriyananda was very keen on, is what kind of leadership. And his feeling was it had to be supportive leadership, inclusive leadership, a leadership that brought people together and set the tone for where we as a group is going to go. So he naturally was inclined that way by his own personality, but he didn't monopolize leadership. And I think this is one of the hallmarks of a great person who is a leader, is he was able to pass that spirit on. And so he would often say, he said, many spiritual groups, spiritual movements, communities even as well, you could include in that, they have a life only as long as that of the founder. After the founder goes, it tends to dissolve, often, many. And he said, why? It doesn't have to be that way. He says, because that founder did not instill that ability to pass on that leadership quality to succeeding generations. And so he was keen on that. And it was the mark of one of his successes. Swami's been gone now for over 10 years now. But yet Ananda continues and even before he died, he had passed on leadership in pretty much everything to those who followed him in different ways in the different Ananda communities. And I think the same thing is it takes leadership, but that leadership has to be one who brings other people up behind them. So that spirit then goes through the community as somebody is going to lead, and other people are going to be inspired by that to also take it on. And in this way, I think by this spirit, we make a community ours. You see, the community belongs to the members. It's for the members' purpose. The community exists in order to help individuals spiritually grow, however we express that. And it's for that benefit. If you have a community just for the as an expression of an individual, well, it's not really fulfilling its real purpose, spiritual purpose, which is to help others, those who are members, and perhaps by extension, those people who are inspired by whatever that community does. And so Swamiji always said, and then I think this is something, is if you're involved in an activity, say you're a leader of a certain manager of a certain aspect, you should be training your successor, inspiring your successor. Don't make it your own so that you can't be replaced. I think in a corporate world, sometimes this isn't stressed because if you're a manager in a certain department, you don't want your successor. You're going to lose your job. You're afraid, oh my God, if I teach everything I know to everybody else, they're going to let me go and get some young low-cost guy to come in and take my place, which happens. And unfortunately, that happens. You're replaced by somebody more economical. That's not the spirit that we want. We want to be right from the beginning because we graduate. Everybody, you do something long enough, golly, I've been doing this for 10, 20 years, whatever it might be. Let me go on to some new horizon. Because the spiritual growth is that which we're aimed for. But I think this spirit keeps the community fresh. It keeps the community fresh in that way. People are coming up at all times and expressing in their own potential. Again, I mentioned this point. Don't ask people to embrace a way of life too radically different from your own. And a few other points. I think things. Sometimes there was a fellow, probably 50, 60 years ago. He was a very creative man. His name escapes me at the moment, but he had these ideals. He was an architect. He had ideals for the perfect community. And the community and design would help. Through design, you would be able to physically help create a community by that way. And actually, there is truth to that. Design can be, if you're laying out a project, it can hinder community or it can help community. Design can bring people together or it can isolate people. We've learned that. And there's certain things, some of the most important buildings, I have always thought at Ananda Village, you'd say, oh, it's the temple, brings people. Well, that's true. It's an important to have a temple. But for many, many years, we just had makeshift temples. I've always, right now, I think one of the most important community that brings people together, it's the mail room. Everybody gets mail and notices. People communicate through messages. That goes to the mailroom. And you see people. Second one is the recycling area. Everybody has trash. So they come together. And I come to there, bring my trash down on Saturday morning. You dump it in the right place. I see people, hey, how you doing? And people I wouldn't normally actually even see. So I thought, and I'm being a little bit facetious here, but there's truth to it. Other one would be a market. We have a market, and it's not very economical to have this market, but it brings people together. Everybody needs that quart of milk or whatever, and people come and as long as I'm here, I'm going to sit and chat with people, have a cup of coffee or tea. These are things that need to be thought out. What brings people together, what isolates people. And so yes, but this fellow, he thought, well, I'll design the perfect community. And he had it so perfect and everything, but he never got anybody to come. because nobody was inspired to go there. And his years would go by, decades went by, and there was, you could even take a tour of this place because he actually started building buildings, and a lot of it was just pictures on the wall of what was going to come, but it never happened. And so consequently, because his ideals behind everything were too utopian, and nobody ever went. So consequently, is that really a community? Is it useful? So we don't want to do that. Do what works. Be practical, even though sometimes, even as Ananda, we've been criticized. We're too practical. We're not idealistic enough. We don't grow all of our own vegetables, and we go to the store. So but we have a good community spirit. And that's what the important point is. I think there also needs to be, communities can be socially, in the worst case scenario, they can be socially oppressive. Small town consciousness. You don't want to have that. You have to allow people to change, allow people to make mistakes. And I think it comes back to respect for the individual, which you see in a community that has to be heightened, because you're trying to encourage people not to express their ego, but when you respect the person as an individual soul, child of God, and then give that person a freedom to express on the higher octave, you find wonderful things can happen. All sorts of interesting things happen, but it's not outwardly, the outward expectations. If you have to be this way, that way, you got to dress this way, that way, you have to say this thing or that thing. And I think that freedom of respect for the individual, but yet holding up the idea, let's as individuals work together. You see, now these are spiritual things. The spirit is there. And so you don't try to enforce conformity, or you don't try to enforce people to behave in this way or that way, but you inspire people to work together. And that, I think, needs to be a foundational principle. And I think this is the work. Is in Ananda's system, what we have is we have general managers who do the practical work, but then we also have spiritual managers, spiritual leaders. And I think this is, Swamiji always said, he wanted to see every community have a spiritual director and you might say, a managerial director to sort of oversee the this and the that of practical things. And we was once asked, what is the role of the spiritual director? And he said, it's one of them, and could be many, but one of them, the primary ones, is to look out for the welfare of the individual, spiritual welfare of the individuals in a community. You see, because sometimes the pressures of community can lose sight of that. But there has to be a balance, and of course, individuals are more important than people are more important than things. But that doesn't mean that people shouldn't be expected to sacrifice for the good of the whole. And so, remember that point. I said it already. Successful communities belong to its members. So members have to feel invested in what they're doing. And how do we do that? Practically, yes, commitments I mentioned, but also, goes beyond that. It's invested. I want to see this community succeed. And so if we can instill that in one another, then we find that we are more likely to. Now, I'm going to leave it at that right now. Probably some more are going to occur to me by next week. But I want to come back next week, and I hope I've been able to stimulate some questions for you, in you, so that we can come back and we'll finish up with one session of question and answers. But if there's lots of questions, we'll continue and perhaps have more than one. So it's in your hands right now to take the initiative. So God bless all of you, and I wish all of you the very, very best. Joy to all of you, and I hope to see you again next week. Joy to you.